my water just broke. I felt like things really intensified.
She was right there and she was coming.
It was an amazing feeling.
I'm gonna cry just thinking about it. I could feel her head.
We heard her cry. We were squeezing hands and she was screaming.
I'm Bryn Hunt-Palmer, and you're listening to The Birth Hour. This podcast is designed as a safe place for women to come together to share their childbirth stories. Stick around and join us to hear informative and empowering birth journeys from women all over the world. Today's guest is Denene Millner, a New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist whose insightful and captivating pieces have secured her foothold in the entertainment, parenting, social media, and book publishing industries. She is also the founder and editor of MyBrownBaby.com, a critically acclaimed blog that examines the intersection of parenting and motherhood through the multicultural experience. In this episode of The Birth Hour, she is sharing her experience giving birth to her daughter at a teaching hospital in Harlem, New York. Denine had a doctor that she loved, the support of her husband, and had made plans ahead of time for what she thought would be a great hospital birth experience. Unfortunately, she was treated like a second-class citizen for the majority of her time in the hospital, and in this episode, she shares her story and discusses some of the issues that many Black women face when it comes to pregnancy and childbirth in America. Hi, Denine. Welcome to The Birth Hour. Thanks for being here today to share your birth story.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's start off by having you tell the listeners a little bit about you and your family.
I'm Denene Millner. I am the editor of MyBrownBaby.com, which is a passion project of mine. It's a website that chronicles the intersection of parenting and race. And when I'm not working on My Brown Baby, I am an author by trade. That's how we keep the lights on around here. I've written 25 books altogether, 4 of them New York Times bestsellers, and I'm a longtime journalist.
I know you list all your books on your website, and I'm just like, how does one person write this many books? It's pretty amazing.
My kids like to eat.
Yeah. Good point. And you have 2 kids, right?
I have 3. So
3?
I have I have a son who lives in Houston. He's an engineer. He's my husband's son from his first marriage, but my son too. And then I have 2 daughters, Mari and Lila, ages 17 and 14.
Awesome. And are you going to be sharing mostly Mari's story today, or do you want to share both? Okay.
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, let's start off by just talking about finding out you were pregnant and what it looked like, finding a doctor and planning out your birth plan.
Sure. Well, goodness. So ironically, I found my OBGYN while I was a journalist for the Daily News in New York. I was first a political reporter there and then an entertainment reporter. And I had to write a story for a section that we had in the newspaper called Thursday. Really hokey. It was Thursday, Thersday, and it was like the women's section on Thursdays. Mother's Day was coming up, and I had gotten this book across my desk. The name of it escapes me, but the author's name is Hilda Hutcherson. And it was a book it was sort of like a Black version of What to Expect When You're Expecting. But it focused more on African-American women and what we could expect when we're pregnant and how to deal with all these different situations that weren't necessarily covered in a lot of the other birthing books. And so I decided to do a story on Hilda, who had 5 children. And I thought it was fascinating. She was the bigwig at Columbia Presbyterian in New York and had written this book, and she had all these kids. And I wanted to talk to her about Mother's Day from an African-American perspective. And so before we hang up the phone, she says, "So who's your OBGYN?" And I was so embarrassed because I was, 26 years old? And I didn't have one. I never had one. I had a regular doctor that I saw whenever I got sick, but I never saw an OBGYN. And so I was embarrassed to say that to her. She's like, "Look, you need to come into my office. Call my office right now and make an appointment. I'm going to see you next week." And that's how I found my OBGYN. I had interviewed her, and she insisted that I come to her office and take care of my body. And a couple of years later, I got pregnant, and she was the one who delivered my baby.
Wow, that's definitely a unique story for how you found your doctor.
Yeah. She's pretty awesome. Just one of those people, and we still keep in touch to this day. She's one of those people who cares tremendously about women's health and specifically women's sexual reproductive health. And she went on later to be this hugely popular author writing books about sex and how women can find pleasure. And she was at some point or another a regular on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and had a column in a couple of national women's magazines about sexual reproductive health and also sexual health, like how women could find pleasure, respect, and love their bodies in a way that we aren't necessarily taught to as we're growing up.
I'm excited to list those as some resources on the website for sure. I hadn't heard of her yet. So when you became pregnant, did you then kind of go back to your initial research and use that book that had been recommended?
I did, but I had one better. I had the actual woman who wrote it. And so that was one of my Bibles for sure. I think at the time, Baby Center was just starting to become a big deal. And so I was signed up for the monthly newsletters and, combing all through that website for information. This is 17 years ago, 18 years ago, really, if we count the 9 months that I was pregnant. And so there weren't a whole lot of resources online like there are now.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't a whole lot of information out there specifically for Black moms. And I'm not saying that Black moms have alien babies that, aren't sort of baking in our bellies the same way as anyone else's. But there are some things that are just unique to Black women that need to be discussed and talked about. And it was helpful to have someone who was a mother of 5, who was, an OBGYN, who had already written sort of this authoritative book on what it is that I should expect as a Black woman, and also someone who was very candid with me and very honest with me and open to me asking every question there was, and not rushing through my appointments, and, being very kind and careful with me, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm sure you recognized at that point that it wasn't something that everyone had access to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was very fortunate in that I had a really good job and great health benefits. I, have a husband. We had a, middle class existence. He had insurance. I'd saved up plenty of time, vacation time and maternity leave time to be able to stay home with my baby. There was just a lot of good things that were going on for me, but there were still, a lot of things that were really annoying that I had to deal with as a woman of color pregnant in New York City.
What were some of those things?
The issue with being a Black woman in America sometimes is that you're invisible and people don't really see you coming. They don't notice you. And if they do, they don't really give you the respect that they would white women, to be candid. I'm not, playing victim or the race card. I'm saying what is true. And so I would get on the train with a belly out to here, and, men would sit down in the seats and literally sit there with their man spreading legs all the way across the seats, and their New York Times spread from one arm to the other. And my belly would literally be sitting in their faces, and they wouldn't offer a seat, or they'd see me kind of rumbling around the train, herking and jerking, and it just never occurred to them okay, this woman is 6 months pregnant. Maybe I should give her my seat, or maybe I should ask her if she's okay. My legs would be swollen. No one would notice. I was pregnant for quite a bit of time during the winter, and there was a lot of ice on the sidewalks. And I remember one day very distinctly that I needed to get to the train station. There was a lot of ice on the sidewalk, and it was a 2-block walk to 2 blocks, New York City blocks, from my office to Penn Station. And I just couldn't bear to walk on that ice. I was just sure I was going to fall flat on my face and my belly. And so we had a shuttle that would take everybody to like 3 major points in New York City to get to your commute. So it was Grand Central Station, Penn Station, and another spot that escapes me right now. And so usually people who were going to Penn Station didn't go onto the shuttle because Penn Station was just 2 blocks away, but there was ice on the ground and I needed, a ride. It was a long day and I was just really scared to death of walking on that ice. And so I got on the shuttle and everybody on the bus had a problem with me being on the bus because they were going to be late to their trains at Grand Central Station if the bus driver had to drive me to Penn Station. And they ended up, it felt like a cabal, like people just yelling at me and, giving me snide looks and talking over me and through me, but not to me, including the bus driver who said, well, I would take you straight to Grand Central Station, but this gal here can't walk the 2 blocks to the train station. And where I come from, my parents are from the South. And when you call a Black woman a gal, you might as well be calling her the N-word. It's insulting. It's a deep insult. I'm a grown woman with a baby in my belly. You don't call me gal, just like you don't call a grown Black man boy. And so that day, I just decided, okay, I need to go on ahead and buy a car. I bought a car that weekend so that I could drive back and forth to work without dealing with this sort of invisibility that comes with being a Black woman, because I needed to protect my baby. It was dangerous to do the things that were expected of me to do when people deemed me invisible. And it may not seem like a big deal to some, but it was a big deal to me. With my baby in my belly, my first child, I wanted to make sure that she was safe. I wanted to make sure that I was safe. And it just didn't feel like I was getting the respect that pregnant women should get when they're carrying children.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only imagine that without carrying a child feeling that way. And then you have that mama bear instinct kicking in and it just must be 10 times worse.
Absolutely, without question. And so, a lot of it got alleviated the moment that I got behind the wheel of my own car.
Well, that's good at least. All right, well, let's start getting into the birth story then, unless there's anything that happened during your pregnancy that you wanted to share.
No, I had such a beautiful pregnancy with Mari. That's my first baby. She's such a little sweetie pie. She used to stick her little booty out. I'll never forget what that felt like to look down at my stomach and feel it stretching and her little booty just kind of sticking out. I mean, rubbing her booty and telling her, come on, kid, stop sticking out that booty. And she's going to have a big booty like her mom. And then, it was a pretty uneventful pregnancy once I was able to sort of get the hang of being able to protect her. And she was just a sweet kid. I would read to her and sing to her and play music for her. And I had the weirdest cravings with her. I wanted to so desperately to eat Tide.
Oh, no.
Random. But I really wanted to eat Tide. It wasn't just a matter of eating it. I wanted to taste it. I wanted to feel it on my teeth, grit my teeth. I don't know what it was. But later on, I found out that I probably had some iron deficiencies, which is kind of typical of African-American women, particularly in the South, even though I was in the North. But the iron deficiency ends up manifesting itself in you wanting to eat starch. I know my mom used to tell me that down south, people would eat either Argo starch or by the spoonful or eat red clay. And that was all sort of a part of this deficiency of iron. And so, but to this day, Mari loves the smell of Tide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because she's a weirdo.
Yeah, I've heard about that before, but you're the first person I've spoken to who actually had that craving. Must have been so weird.
It was very, very odd and went right away the moment that I gave birth.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Well, how far along were you when you went into labor?
I was induced.
Oh, okay.
I was induced on the day before Mari was due. So she was born on her due date. A week before I was to give birth to her, I went to my doctor, and Hilda told me that she felt like my baby was going to be super big, and that if I didn't give birth within the next few days, that she was probably going to induce me because they were afraid that if the baby stayed in any longer, that she would be too big for me to birth, which was really, really weird because Mari was born 5 pounds, 11 ounces. She was a little teeny weeny thing. Both of my babies were tiny.
Yeah, I feel like doctors were more liberal with that
Yeah.
10, 15 years ago.
Yeah,
Guessing
absolutely.
the size.
Right, exactly. And so, surprise to me when she came out at 5'11", and Lila came out at 5'8.5" or something like that. And so, so I went to her the day before I was due. My water still hadn't broken. And she says, okay, meet me at the hospital. I'm going to have you induced. And sure enough, I went to the hospital and they gave me Cervidil. And before the Cervidil could even do anything, my water broke right on the table, right as they were putting the Cervidil in. And I was in labor for about 3 hours with Mari. And she was born after 20 minutes of pushing. She was, came in right on time, 2:20 in the morning.
Yeah, that's crazy fast for an induction, too.
Yep, that's my baby. That's who she is to this day. One of those kids who's, insistent on being on time and, and, little trouble and just very, easy. She is the epitome of what my actual giving birth was like. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually hear that a lot.
Right. The beauty of my birth was we go to the hospital and Hilda is on vacation. So even though I'd been communicating with her and her part, she had a practice with 5 other OBGYNs, all women. And I'd met all of them except for one. And so though Hilda was communicating with me over the phone, I was being seen by one of her partners. And the partner was the one who told me to go to the hospital and they were going to induce. And, I was scared because Hilda she was on vacation and she was the one that I trusted the most, even though there was one particular partner that I really loved. And so, I'd get to the hospital and the one who's on call is, of course, the one that I didn't meet. And it's the middle of the night. So she has an attitude and, it's just one of those things where it's kind of awkward, like, who are you? And she's like, who are you? And we're going to do this dance with this monumental thing happening, but we don't know each other. And I just really, really wanted Hilda to be there, but I knew she lived upstate at the time and she was on vacation. It was like 2.5-hour drive for her to get to the hospital. And so right when it was time for me to push at 2 o'clock in the morning, it was like a light hit the door. And who walks in but Hilda Hutcherson, like this angel from on high. She comes strolling in with her scrubs on and her hair tied back and comes in with that big, gigantic, beautiful smile and says, I wouldn't have missed this little world.
Aww.
And she comes in and I hike my legs up and 20 minutes later, she was catching my baby. She was amazing.
That's a good doctor. That's awesome.
Absolutely. She was amazing. Yeah, that was an amazing experience to have her be in that room and to care enough about me and care enough about my baby to take time off of her busy schedule and drive 2.5 hours to make sure that she was there for my child and to catch my baby. Yeah.
Was she surprised by the weight too?
She was, absolutely, very much so. Just was just like, oh, well, she's smaller than I expected. But, like it wasn't a big, gigantic, conversation. It was just like, this is my baby. Let's get her cleaned up and get her back over here so she can breastfeed and I can look in her face and I could call her name and I can hug her and kiss her and, be in love. Mm-hmm. Just love this moment. Just be in love with this baby.
And then what was your postpartum experience like?
So for all of the heaven that I experienced having the baby, afterwards was just hell. It really was just ridiculous. So, Hilda, after helping me have my baby, went home because it was her vacation. And because like I mentioned before, I had great insurance. I made a birth plan at the hospital. It was at Columbia Presbyterian. I made a point of going and seeing the facilities. I filled out all this paperwork, paid extra money so that I could have my own private room. I wanted it to be a special evening for my husband and I, and so I paid extra money so that we would have a really nice dinner and some champagne for him, not for me, because I knew I was going to be breastfeeding, so that we could really enjoy the days that we had in the hospital before we took our baby home. And I planned that practically as soon as I found out I was pregnant, after I found out that I was having a girl, not when I found out I was pregnant. We made an appointment, went over, looked at the facilities, and made arrangements. I fully expected that because I made these arrangements that all of this would be in my files and what I'd arranged would be available to me. And so I had the baby and they cleaned her up and they gave her back to me. I noticed a prick in her foot. And what is that? Why is my baby's, foot, like, what's with this prick in her foot? And it turns out that they had given her a drug test to make sure that I wasn't on drugs. I was just shocked. I was like, wait, what? Like, I've never taken drugs in my life. And I don't recall anybody asking me if you could test my baby for drugs. And what would possess you to think that I would be on drugs or that you would have to test my baby for drugs? And I was told that it was just standard procedure. I would later find out that that standard procedure that I'm saying that with my fingers in the air and making air quotes was standard procedure mostly for Black women, not for anyone else. The assumption being that because I was Black, that I might have a higher incidence of using drugs. And so they would check my baby to see if my kid, if any drugs that I may have taken may have been passed on to my child. And then I presume that if there was any kind of trace of drugs in my kid's system, then I would be in big trouble and, risk having my baby taken away. And I was just deeply offended by that. Like, who, because of the color of my skin, you need to assume that something may be wrong, that I may be taking drugs. Never in my life. I'm almost 48 years old. I've never touched anything stronger than a cigarette once in high school and knew, then that this was not for me, so the nerve. So I get my baby back and we go to the room and they put me in a room with 6 other women, in a room with 8 beds, and there's 6 other women there. And I'm kind of looking around, I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe this is the holding room until I get to that special private room that I paid for and that my insurance is paying for and that I paid for. I'm a little hungry, when is my special dinner coming? And I don't say anything because, hey, I just pushed a human out of my loins. So I'm just going to lay here and just rest for a little bit. And maybe, someone will get around to, letting me know when I make this transfer to this room. So my husband comes and he comes with flowers and comes to see me. And the nurse tells him that he can't be there. And I'm like, excuse me? And she says, well, only the fathers of the children can be here. And I'm like, well, that's the father of my child. Well, it has to be a spouse. And I'm like, that's my husband. And she looks at me and then she looks at him and she says, you're married? And now I'm ready to have a second, baby, a cow.
Yeah.
like, what are you talking about? I just told you that's my husband. This is my ring on my finger. Yes, that's my husband. And I would really like him to stay with me. And so, just the shock that ran across her face that here was this Black woman with a husband who was there supporting her and who was there and helped to make this baby was just a revelation to this woman for some reason. And, offense number 2. And so, my husband and I kind of looked at each other. Now, to be fair, at the time I looked like I was 12. I look way younger than I actually am. And at the time I looked like a baby. And so she may have thought that I was, like a teen mom, but the nerve to, even think about fixing your mouth to say that to a teen mom. Like, if I tell you something, it is not your job to assume something different or to make, saddle me and stereotype while you're dealing with me. And so that was just sort of the entree to what was to happen through the rest of the next 36 hours. And so after a couple of hours of sitting in this room with these women who, I wasn't supposed to be with, I was supposed to be in a private room, I finally called a nurse and I said, hey, I'm wondering when I'm going to be transferred to my private room. And she looks at me and she says, well, this is your room. And I was like, actually, I paid for, and my insurance is covering a private room. And I paid for the dinner. We're really hungry and it's getting late and my husband and I would like to enjoy our dinner. And so she says, what do you paid for that? It was just shocking to her. And so I was like, I'm sure if you checked my records, you would see that I did. I came and I made arrangements months ago. And so she checked my records and she comes in with an attitude. She says, oh, okay, yeah, sure. You're supposed to be in a separate room. So another hour goes by before they put me into the separate room. And then another hour goes by after that before they bring us our cold steak and lobster and our, our warm champagne. And I know this sounds so, bougie and snobby. It just coming out of my mouth, it sounds that way, even to me. But you have to understand, and I don't know if I'm expressing it in a way that, makes it real and plain, but when I was in the middle of it, it just felt like one slap after the other. Just this sort of assumption about who I was, this assumption about what kind of family I had, the assumption about who this man was that was with me, the assumption of the kind of mother I was going to be, the assumption of what my background was and the kind of treatment that I deserved because they assumed that I was one person versus another, and how disgusting it is that you would even think to treat someone in that kind of way, regardless of what their circumstances are, particularly after something as emotional and beautiful and incredible and miraculous as having a baby. I wanted nothing more than to have this really beautiful experience having my baby. And I had that experience giving birth to her, but the after, part of being in this hospital, which is a teaching hospital in the middle of Harlem. And so there is a segment of the community that very clearly the folks there at the time looked at with contempt and disregard. And that's the only way that I can describe it, because that's the way that I was being treated, with contempt and disregard. The only thing that I could conclude is that I was being treated that way because I am Black and because I looked young. And so let me just go ahead and treat this girl like she's some welfare queen who is having yet another baby, who's going to be sucking off the teat of, the American benefit system. And she's going to walk out of here and barely raise these kids. And I'm going to be responsible. My taxpayer dollars are going to be responsible for it. That is the way that I was being treated the entire time that I was in that hospital after I gave birth to my baby. And so we finally got into this room and I was, just overwhelmed with happiness for my baby, but for having my baby, but also just this disgust with the way that, my husband and I were being treated. And so they brought the baby in and left her with me and proceeded to leave her with me for 9 hours without ever once checking on me, without ever once, coming through and asking me if I needed a diaper, if I needed help feeding her, if I wasn't breastfeeding, she surely would have, starved to death. Nobody brought any formula by. I mean, it was odd. It was like they tucked me in this room and then punished me by not coming back and making sure that we were okay.
Which, if anyone who's given birth knows that they're usually bugging you like every 30 minutes.
Every second of the time that you're there. Like when I gave birth to Lila, almost to the day, 3 years later in a different hospital, they were harassing me, no lie, every 40 minutes. I was just like, can y'all leave me the hell alone? Like, can you please leave me alone? I can get some rest and maybe feed this baby and we can just chillax. Can we do that? But in this, with Mari, I could have thrown her against the wall and nobody would have known. I could have smothered her and nobody would have known. I could have, done anything to this baby in some kind of crazy haze. Nobody would have known. So when the next shift came, a nurse finally came in and asked me how I was doing. And I was still a little out of it and groggy and was a little frustrated because I wasn't sure if the baby was breastfeeding or not. Like, I had her on my breast, but nobody showed me how to breastfeed. And all the things I had read about it just weren't computing when I was trying to breastfeed her. And so this nurse came in and she came with like this big gigantic bag of like baby formula and like tchotchkes that I would never use. And saw me breastfeeding. She says, "Oh, you're breastfeeding." Like, that was a shock. And so I was like, yeah, I'm breastfeeding. I don't really need your formula, but I do need someone to show me if I'm doing this correctly so that this baby, isn't starving to death, because she seemed frustrated and I was getting a little frustrated not knowing if she was eating or not. And so she kind of reached over and, grabbed my breast and showed me how to, do it. And then called a lactation specialist who came in and showed me how to take the baby off of my breast and how to make sure that she was getting, what she needed and all of that stuff. And it was La Leche League, thank God, just a bunch of angels that came in and showed me how to do it. And it was only then when that second shift came in that, I felt like somebody actually cared that I was there with a new human being on my breast. I just wanted to get out of there. I just remember like, okay, I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to cause a ruckus. I'm not going to cause a stir. I'm not going to curse anybody out. I'm not going to do anything but sit here and be quiet, because these people have already displayed to me the contempt and the ease with which they do things with my baby without my permission. Who knows how they'll respond to me being mean or making demands. They could do anything to my baby. They could do anything to me. They could call a social worker down here and decide, oh, well, she's not a good mother or she's hurt her baby, and so we'll take her away. Like, that fear was very real. And again, like, I know that people will listen to this story and think, oh, she's mad because her lobster and her steak and her champagne wasn't there on time. That's not it. It was the contempt that we could feel. It was palpable. We could cut it with a knife in the air. My husband will tell you the same thing, that just felt like if we did anything wrong, someone would do something to us, would do something to our baby. And so I just decided it was safer for me to just keep my mouth shut. And when my doctor came in, if I could beg her to let me go home early, then I would do that. Like, please just let me go home. Let me take this baby home. I'll be fine. I promise, whatever you tell me I need to do, if you tell me I need to lay in the bed for another 48 hours, another week, I'll do that. If you tell me that I need to come and see you in 12 hours after I get home, I'll do that. Whatever you tell me to do, I'll do. But please let me get out of this hospital. I don't feel safe here. I don't feel like my baby and I are safe. I want to leave. And so she very graciously, so Hilda didn't come back. It was the partner that I really liked who came. And I told her what was going on, showed her, oh God, that there was a shower that was just absolutely disgusting. It had mold all over everything. I just wanted to get out of there. It was horrible. And so she allowed me to be discharged a day early. I was supposed to stay there for 2 days. I ended up staying for one and leaving the very next day. I'm grateful to her for making that call and letting me take my baby home so that I didn't have to deal with that crazy at the hospital. It was crazy.
Had Hilda mentioned any of this to you? She's obviously experienced with, Black women giving birth, and it seems like she would have encountered it or gotten complaints before.
Right. I don't know that anybody had ever complained about it before. She didn't mention it. By the time I saw Hilda again, she came off her vacation. It was 6 weeks later, and I wasn't focused on that. I was focused on, okay, is my baby okay? Am I okay? Is everything okay? It didn't really process for me, how disgusting it was, what happened in that hospital until much later when I thought about it a little harder and, really considered what the hell was going on for real in that hospital and, the contempt that they held for me. So I didn't really mention it to her, but this kind of interaction, I would later go on to find out, is sort of what happens to Black women during pregnancy and during birth and during postpartum. What happens when your doctor isn't, what's the way to say it, isn't attentive, isn't as, attentive to the needs of you and your baby, you and your pregnancy, isn't as invested in making sure you're okay. It's almost like that contempt, you can feel it, that stress, you can feel it. And that stress the stress of not feeling like you're in the best, most capable hands can transfer down to your baby. And I really do believe that plays a significant role in why birth rates are so low in the African American community, why infant mortality is so high in the African American community. There are statistics that show that infant mortality in the Black community rivals third world nations. Here in America, rivals third world nations where, medical access is nowhere near as accessible as here in our communities. And I wish people would study it more. I wish that there was more thought into why this is going on. There's a whole lot of speculation about why it is. And as women who are brown and who give birth to babies, we can paint these pictures of the treatment that we get. But until someone takes it seriously and really kind of studies why it is that someone living a middle-class life, upper middle-class life, if you look just at Black families and income, has a husband, lives in a good neighborhood, has insurance, is being very well taken care of by a doctor who really cares for her, why my baby would still be 5 pounds, 11 ounces. What is that? Why is that? That's something that's really kind of standard for Black babies, to be born underweight. Well, why is that? I did everything that I was supposed to do. I ate well. I made sure that I made it to all of my appointments. I tried my best to take it easy. I bought a car so that I wouldn't be sort of jiggering around on a train or walking across ice. I did everything I was supposed to do, and still I had a low birth weight baby. And the same for the second baby, with, equal care from another doctor at a different hospital. I don't think that it's taken seriously. The stress that comes with being Black and pregnant, and the stress that comes with being Black and giving birth, and the stress that comes with the care that we receive after, or the lack thereof. And so, that ends up affecting our babies greatly. Lack of access to, and this is for someone who's speaking from a very privileged upper middle class existence. Imagine what that's like for someone who does not have access to one of the best doctors in the country, who does not have insurance, who does not live in an area where there's a plethora of doctors who are, really interested in making sure that your well-being is just as being taken care of, that your baby and your pregnancy is being taken care of like those of others. So when you factor that in, it makes sense that our babies are suffering, that our women are suffering. Something needs to be done.
Are there any resources that you would direct people toward to find some of these answers, or really just something that's not being addressed?
I think that focusing on organizations that actually study this from a whole and very sort of Afrocentric perspective is helpful. If I had to do it all over again, if I gave birth to a baby today and not 17 years ago, I would have so gotten myself a doula. I would have so had my baby probably at home or at a birthing center somewhere that was outside of a hospital experience. I love Hilda to death, and I'm so glad that she was there to catch my baby. That's what I call it. That's what we call it. You caught my baby. But, if I had to do it today, knowing what I know about birth rates, statistics, and infant mortality in my community, I would have totally gotten myself a doula. And, there are some tremendous birth justice organizations out there that are really trying to make a difference with reproductive justice and with birthing justice. And so a couple of them I would recommend. Radical Doula is a good one. And they talk a lot about issues affecting doulas of color and progressive politics and talk about women of color and birthing. And they have a great directory for people who want to be doulas and also for doulas if you want to hire one. There's another organization called Sun-Kissed Doulas, and they're advocating on behalf of women of color and trying to up the number of African American doulas that are out there, and being able to pair folks with people who will help them, just sort of navigate the system. There's a Sister Song. That's a spectacular organization. It's a collective of like 80 organizations for women of color and allies that are aimed toward educating women of color about their reproductive rights, and they advocate for access to healthcare services and empower women to raise their voices and advocate for themselves and their communities. They target not just African Americans, they do African Americans, Arab Americans, Middle Eastern, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latina, and Native American Indigenous people. And so, that's a great one for just sort of talking about ways that we can help one another. And then there's Mamas of Color Rising, a collective of working class and poor mothers of colors based in and around Austin, Texas. Hey, Austin, shout out. And, they do some pretty incredible work too. And so, those are some of the ones that I've paid attention to and, tapped into as resources as I cover this on My Brown Baby. And then, of course, My Brown Baby, where we talk about a whole lot of things. And one of those things is birthing while Black and the need for more support for African American women during pregnancy and childbirth and aftercare, and what we can all do to make the experiences better than kind of the experience that I had after Mari was born.
What did you do when you were planning your second birth? I know you switched hospitals. Like, what did you look for to ensure that that wouldn't happen again?
I looked for, quite frankly, a hospital that wasn't a teaching hospital, because I knew that a teaching hospital would have more of a chance of having a community of patients that couldn't afford care. And if you can't afford care, you just get treated differently. That's, the beginning and end of it. So I knew that I wanted to be somewhere where folks would treat me like someone who had insurance and who could afford to be there. It sounds horrible, but it is what it is. I wanted to be in a place where I wouldn't be treated like, someone other than who I was, which was unfairly. And so I found this hospital and I found a doctor that I thought I liked. She turned out to be incredibly mediocre compared to Hilda. And the only reason I didn't stay with Hilda was because I refused to go back to the hospital that she operated out of. So I ended up finding this other doctor who wasn't really attentive, who really didn't seem to have my baby's best interest at heart. My pregnancy, she didn't really take that very seriously. I didn't feel like it. And when I went to this hospital, this experience was a completely different experience. So I was in labor with Lila for 17 hours. I was hooked up to all these machines. The first time around, I wasn't hooked up to anything but sort of that belly monitor. But with Lila, I was on IVs. I had a catheter. I had just all of these machines just kind of hooked up to me. And I was just like, I'm having a baby. Why am I tied down to this bed like, about to have major surgery? It was just odd. And I remember them checking the baby's heartbeat and deciding that her heartbeat was weak. And so they wanted me to lay on my left side so that pressure or something would be off of the baby so that her heartbeat would be stronger. So I listened to them and I laid on my left side. And I laid on my left side for 17 hours because they wouldn't let me turn over because they insisted that if I turned over that I could endanger the baby. Now I'm telling you, I'm tied up to all these machines, including a catheter. I'm laying on my left side for 17 hours, unable to move like, some kind of beached whale waiting for something to happen. And when the shift changed, I convinced the next nurse to let me turn over. And so she came and I was like, please, can I please just turn over to my right side? Because my left side, I feel like, it's numb. Pretty soon, I'm sure I'll have bed sores or something. Like, please let me just for a few minutes, let me turn over to the other side. And don't you know, as soon as I turned over to my right side, I dilated. Lila was born 5 minutes later.
Oh my gosh.
3 pushes. My doctor didn't even make it upstairs. Some random guy meandering down the hallway stuck his head into the room. My legs are wide open. The baby's head is literally crowning. And he says, oh my God, comes in and delivers my baby. I have no idea who this person was. He could have been the janitor. He could have been the head of surgery, the head of obstetric. I don't know who he was, but he was the one who was there giving birth, who, caught my baby. That experience, even more so than the first experience, made me feel like, God, if I were ever to do this again, I would be somewhere like at my house with a midwife and a doula and just, doing this on my own. Neither experience really kind of panned out to what I expected it to be outside of Hilda walking in like an angel and helping me give birth to my baby. There just wasn't a whole lot of trust in me or my body to be able to do what it is that human bodies do when they're pregnant, which is to just push the baby out. It really isn't all that deep. I didn't need to be tied up to 8,000 machines and made to lay on my left side like some like fattened cow, waiting for slaughter. That's what it felt like. And so I promised myself that if I ever got pregnant again, I would do it a wholly different way. But I haven't gotten pregnant again.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your birth stories and all of those resources with us. I think this is going to be such an amazing episode for people to really learn a lot through your experience. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I appreciate you for telling the stories and making a space for women to be able to share them and to take something from each one of these stories to make their birthing experience better. It's a pretty amazing thing. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. And can you tell the listeners the best place to connect with you online?
Sure. I'm My Brown Baby everywhere. So it's mybrownbaby.com is the website. And then on Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest, I'm My Brown Baby. And on Facebook, it's My Brown Baby Fans.
Perfect. Well, we'll link to all of those from your show notes page so people can just click right over and hopefully keep the conversation going a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again so much, Denine, for coming on the show and sharing your story with all of us. If you want to connect with Denine, I'll be linking to all of her social media information and website from thebirthhour.com. You can just find her show notes page there. And I'll also be linking to some of the resources that we talked about and ones that relate to this episode. You can connect with me on Instagram at thebirthhour. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, head to thebirthhour.com to sign up for our newsletter. And if you really like the show, please subscribe and leave a review in iTunes. I'm Bryn Hunt Palmer, and you've been listening to another episode of The Birth Hour. Thanks again, and see you next week.